Thank you, Senator Di Natale. I call Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. On the weekend I started reading Paul Kelly's book, one he put out a couple of weeks ago, Triumph and Demise, a bit of a yarn on the Labor Party, and it is a bit of a sad book because it does tell the story of the death of the modern Labor Party in some ways, and it's continuing to be sad here tonight with the Labor Party seemingly opposing this bill, given it's something that they actually supported for many years, given it's something that is meant to be pro-business and pro-development, but once again they're now turning their backs on that aspect of their tradition and history, of the Hawke-Keating legacy, if you like, and facing their future, which seems to be wedded to the Greens party. And we don't have so much of an Australian Labor Party anymore, but we have a Green Labor Party, a GLP, has come into existence. I just want to quote, to start with, a little bit from Paul Kelly's book. And into the book he tells the story of the COAG Business Advisory Forum. It chapter 30 starts by saying, "The breach of trust between Julia Gillard and Australian business was sealed on the 6th of December 2012, when at the COAG Business Advisory Forum, Gillard pulled the plug on plans to rationalise the dual Commonwealth State Environmental Approval Project system. The forum, chaired by the PM, was a high-powered group that comprised the Premier's senior business figures and the peak business bodies. In the prelude to the meeting, the Greens had waged a public campaign to kill the reform, and at the penultimate moment, Gillard reversed the government's position. The story is starting to come out here that it was actually the Greens that killed this reform, and I think the Senator Waters is taking credit for that. No, I'm sorry, I missed that, Senator Singh. President of the Business Council goes on to say that the President of the Business Council, Tony Shepherd, said, and I quote, "We felt we had made a lot of progress. Extensive work had been done at a public service level. The idea was to remove unnecessary Commonwealth state duplication and have a single approval agency. We saw this as a tremendous breakthrough, saving time, energy and risk." And then Tony Shepherd went on to say that at the last minute we are told the PM does not believe this is a good idea and we will not proceed. We were extremely upset. We felt we had been misled by the government. I saw this as a breach of trust. We were dealing with a government that was not trustworthy. And it is unfortunate, Mr Acting Deputy President, that the Labor Party are turning their back on that tradition, because we know how costly these duplication processes are. This is not something new. This is not something that has been thought up during an election campaign last year or by this government since it's come into power. This idea that we need to streamline environmental approval processes in this country has been something that's been debated now for many years. Long before this COAG Business Advisory Forum in 2012. Indeed, it was actually the Labor Party that led the charge on these changes. I went back and had a bit of a look at what happened, because I remembered from my previous career before being in this place, when I was at the Productivity Commission, that this was one of the key reforms of the Rudd government. They had a name for those reforms. They were towards a seamless national economy. Very grand, very Kevin Rudd, towards a seamless national economy. And this was one of the reforms. This was one of the reforms, Senator Singh, that you supported. Not anymore. You used to support. Indeed, it goes back to 2008 when Lindsay Tanner delivered a speech at the Sydney Institute, and he said, streamlined environmental assessment process will stop the time-wasting process of two groups. Environmental assessors looking at the same information are holding up approval processes. Later on that year, that was in early 2008, later on that year we had the 2020 summit. Remember the 2020 summit? We had the 2020 summit, and one of the ideas from that summit was to remove the duplication in environmental approval processes. It says, and I quote from the 2020 document, "Rapid development, fast-tracking time-sensitive Australia's processes for developing project approvals and getting regulatory approval to be dramatically accelerated." And now the Labor Party have walked away from that. Craig Emerson in 2011 told Madonna King, Madonna King, an ABC Brisbane radio presenter, a better way is for the federal government to recognise the integrity of state environmental approval processes and avoid this duplication. It's one of the main complaints of business in this country, and that's what we're trying to do. Streamline the process, not to weaken environmental standards, but not to have them duplicated. And now they are walking away from that. Of course, later on, as I said earlier in my remarks, the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard did walk away from that, in late 2012. But that wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't the end of the story because we had one more convolution to happen in that former Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government. They eventually brought Kevin Rudd back. Kevin Rudd came back and he gave a speech. The National Press Club is a very well marketed speech. Mr Acting Deputy President, you might have had something to do with it, but he had 7 points. He had 7 points. He did. He might have had something to do with it. He had 7 points, and the fourth number in those 7 points, just as late as July last year, only just a year ago, was the number 4 point was, we need a new approach to the regulatory impost of business from all levels of government. This particularly applies to multiple and conflicting environmental assessment requirements for state and federal governments. Surely it lies within our wit and wisdom to begin by integrating the assessment procedures and reports at present separately mandated by the Commonwealth and the states. That was just a year ago. It was just a year ago. But like many things in the former government, there was lots of talk, but they never actually got around to making the laws, to putting it in place and putting it into effect. And we see today that they are still taking their writing instructions from the Greens, that they are still in bed with this party, that we have today the 4th year anniversary of their marriage. Remember, we all remember the signing document. We all remember the day. We remember the day because it was the same day. It was a day we had our wattles on our lapels. Sorry, I don't have mine on tonight, but I missed that. Maybe with this side of the House now, they'll be a little bit tarnished for us because it was 4 years ago, Mr Acting Deputy President, that wedding ceremony took place. And we all remember it. We all remember the registry being signed by Bob Brown and Julia Gillard, and they had the little wattles on their lapels, just like a wedding ceremony. They signed the registry book. They went and had a party. They had a hangover. It was called minority government. And we were living with that for 3 years in this country. And we are unfortunately still living with it because the Labor Party haven't woken up to themselves yet and got on the side of jobs and economics and development instead of just being anti all of those things, which they are here tonight. Mr Acting Deputy President, there was good reason that streamlining these environmental approval processes was bipartisan. It was something that both levels of government supported. There was a good reason for it because it made a lot of sense. There was a lot of people making complaints about these issues, and I had some direct experience looking at them. I remember being up at Lake Argyle at the Ord a few years ago. Now, the Ords is a remarkable place for those of us who have been able to be there. I've been there twice, fortunately, in my life, and I was astounded both times. I still remember flying into the place. And the Ord is actually, of course, Lake Argyle is Australia's biggest dam. It's a dam of massive scale, something like 40 times the size of Sydney Harbour. And of course, those on my right will usually say that dams are environmental catastrophes, that any dam is going to wreck the environment. Well, this is a dam that is nowhere near an environmental catastrophe. Indeed, it's a now recognised and internationally recognised environmental asset. The Ord, or Lake Argyle, is the lake formed by the Ord scheme, is now a Ramsar-listed wetland, one of the few Ramsar-listed wetlands in our country, and it's formed by a dam. It's an artificial lake, it's a man-made lake, but because it's a Ramsar-listed wetland, every time now we want to do something with the Ord, we need to get federal government approval because Ramsar-listed wetlands are one of the matters of national environmental significance under this Act, under the EPBC Act. Now, as you might know, Mr Acting Deputy President, the Western Australian Government are putting forward a proposal to develop the Ord, to go to stage 2 of the Ord at the moment. And I was talking to the project manager about this process, and they had to get EPBC approval. And he had some Commonwealth Government bureaucrats come and visit him one day to discuss this approval. And I remember him telling me that it took the bureaucrats asked him a question and said, "How often does the lake run or does the river run?" And he replied, "It always runs all the time." And they didn't believe him. They didn't believe him because it used to be a seasonal system. But of course, with the dam, it maintained continuous flows. It took him 8 weeks to convince the Canberra bureaucrats that actually it does flow all the time because it's a dam, and dams hold water up. And when you hold water up, you sort of have water all the time, or at least you do in the Ord because it's very, very big. Now, there was another saga. The word came back from Canberra that they were worried about some finches. They were worried about some finches, some migratory finches in this part of the world, and they sent up a question asking this person, how are the finches going to migrate over this road? He was going to build a road there as part of the project. And he told them that, well, they're going to fly over it. The finches are going to fly over it. And the bureaucrats told him, I don't think you're taking me seriously. And apparently he told them, I'm taking you deadly seriously. And eventually he was able to get approval. But because of how it works under the EPBC Act, he had to pay for an offset. The offset that they agreed on at the time was $1.5 million for shark research in the Indian Ocean. $1.5 million for shark research in the Indian Ocean. Now, the Ord is on our Indian Ocean side of the country, but it's about 200 kilometres from the Indian Ocean. It's a long, long way. This project had nothing to do with sharks in the Indian Ocean, but that was what was decided as the environmental offset because he had to pay a penance. He had to pay a penance because he was obviously annoying some green god, so he had to pay some money, some green mail, if you like. Now, he wanted to fight that. He thought that was ridiculous to have to do that. He thought he should go through a regulatory process that should be normal and sane, but no, it wasn't normal or sane. And the West Australian government told him, look, don't worry about it, just pay the money. We're not going to fight that. It's only $1.5 million. Only $1.5 million, but that's what happened. There was another project I have some familiarity with, and it's the Nathan Dam as well in Queensland. And that's gone through multiple sagas through the EPBC Act. It was originally proposed back in the 1920s in the Queensland Parliament. It was held up in the early 2000s. It was approved by David Kemp about 12 years ago now. But it was taken to court by I think the Wilderness Society, some green group. It was taken to court, and there was a landmark ruling. They said that the minister hadn't considered the indirect impacts of the dam, and those impacts included the fact that the water was going to be used for cotton production. Cotton production at the time used endosulfan, and endosulfan could possibly end up in the reef. All fair enough and fair and reasonable. But of course now the cotton industry doesn't use endosulfan anymore. It has GM crops, doesn't use that, but the Nathan Dam still hasn't been built. It still hasn't been built because a few years ago the Queensland government was trying to get approval. This was a Labor government at the time. They were trying to get approval for the Nathan Dam for mining projects in the region. And the federal government department again had to be involved because we have these duplicative regulatory approval processes. And the federal government said to them, well, they apparently found 850 boggermoss snails. And the federal government said to the state government, you can't go ahead with the approval because we found these snails. You have to now go and do a few years of seeing if the snails can be relocated and still survive. Still survive. This was a snail-paced development, Mr Acting Deputy President, and it was held up by snails. Now, a couple of years later, about 18 months later, the Queensland Labor government found 18,000 of these boggermoss snails in the region. They were living there and thriving. So they were allowed to restart the process, but of course they'd lost 18 months in the interim, and that project still hasn't been built. I was happy though to see that the coalition government, that the new coalition government, has shortlisted the Nathan Dam as one of 30 dams around the country that have some promise on the weekend. So maybe it will get built, and certainly, Mr Acting Deputy President, if we pass this legislation, it has a lot more chance to get built. And if it has a lot more chance to get built, that will mean there'll be a major project in central Queensland. That will mean there'll be thousands of jobs in central Queensland. That will mean we'll have water for a burgeoning coal mining industry in central Queensland. That means we'll have water for irrigation in central Queensland. That means we'll probably have a future water supply for Toowoomba as well, because water could go from there to it. Now, it's not just those anecdotes, Mr Acting Deputy President, that for the reason why we need to pass these things. It's also true that the body I used to work for, the Productivity Commission, they did this work long after I was gone though. In 2013, they did a major report on development assessment processes, again a report commissioned by the former Labor government, and they had some pretty clear findings from this report. They said that a one-year delay to a major offshore LNG project costs in the order of $500 million to $2 billion. That's a lot of money, Mr Acting Deputy President. They found, on page 197, I'm reliably informed here, that processes take too long or are highly uncertain. A Business Council of Australia member told us it took 10 years to get some basic service centres approved in Western Australia. Another said it took 5 years to have a relatively straightforward mine deepening application approved. Not knowing how long the approval process will take is a deterrent to business investment. The Minerals Council of Australia stated that the average period for approval-related activities for a thermal coal project was just over 3 years, compared to 1.8 years in the rest of the world. Now, these findings led the Productivity Commission to recommend, in Recommendation 7.1, that government should aim to establish a one project, one assessment, one decision framework by restarting negotiations on bilateral approval agreements between the Australian Government and states and territories. Such agreements must assure the environmental standards are not compromised and the rights of appeal are no less than those in the EPBC Act. Now, we are not changing those provisions, Mr Acting Deputy President. Since then, of course, the government has put in place a water trigger, and some changes are being made to that water trigger here. What we are doing is ensuring that the water trigger in this bill is treated exactly the same way as every other matter of national environmental significance in this Act. Now, I accept that the water trigger is a very important part of this bill, that the protection of our aquifers in particular, but all of our water resources is very, very important. And we should go through a process to make sure they're protected. But I don't believe that those aquifers, that those water resources are any more or less important than the Great Barrier Reef, are any more or less important than migratory species, that are any more or less important than our natural springs and our Ramsar wetlands. So if those matters are treated in a certain way and they are all potentially subject to bilateral agreements with state governments, I see no reason why the water trigger should not be as well. As other speakers have said in this chamber, the Commonwealth, even after these changes in this bill, will retain the right to step in, will retain the right to cancel a bilateral agreement at any time, and will retain the right to not approve a project before the state government provides that approval. I just want to finish, though, on talking about my state, Queensland, and in particular the north of Queensland, regional Queensland. This bill is very important for the Nationals Party because most of these projects we're talking about are in regional areas. They are mining projects, they are irrigation projects, they are tourism projects. The Greens opposed a tourism project near where I'm going to live in a few months' time in Rockhampton, the Great Keppel Island project. Couldn't believe they opposed that, but they opposed that too. That needed EPBC approval. That needed EPBC approval. All these projects are in regional areas, and that's where our wealth is created. And there's one project in particular that really frustrated me in the last few years, Mr Acting Deputy President. There's the proposal to build a bauxite mine just south of Weipa, the south of Embley bauxite project. It was a $1.5 billion project in an economically disadvantaged part of our nation. There's not a lot of jobs and growth in that part of our country, unfortunately. There's, of course, many Indigenous people live there, and there's a great need for jobs and employment. And Rio Tinto proposed, and I'll just get these dates so I make them right. I'll just get them off my iPad here. I just looked them up before. The Rio Tinto proposed a few years ago to spend $1.5 billion developing this bauxite mine. It was on the 13th of September 2010 on the Environment website. It says that this project was first released for public comment on the referral, 13th September 2010. It was approved initially sometime here. I can't get that date here, but it was approved, and then the clock was stopped and it was reopened again by Tony Burke, I think in early 2011. But finally, after years of consideration, the Labor government approved this project on the 14th of May 2013 last year. Now, I think if you take the day's difference between the 14th of May 2013 and the 13th of September 2010, I think it's actually 975 days. It took the previous Labor government 975 days to say yes to a $1.5 billion project, a $1.5 billion project in Cape York. It was a disgrace. It was a disgrace because during that time the world had moved on, prices had changed, and Rio had changed. They changed CEOs. They weren't of such a mind to go ahead with it. Now, there's still a chance that might go ahead. There's still a chance it might go ahead, and it's got more chance of going ahead if we pass this bill here. And we need to pass this bill because we need in this country to focus on how we are going to create jobs. We need to focus in this country on how we're going to get development projects approved so that we can do that, particularly in the areas that we represent. I've only been in this job 2 months, but the biggest thing that people come up to me and talk about in central Queensland is jobs, because in the last couple of years alone, 10,000 jobs have been lost in our coal mining industry, and I'm not blaming anyone for that. Prices have fallen. It's a tough time in a cyclical industry. But we can, through passing this bill, make a decision to help that industry, to create more jobs and make sure that people have the opportunity and the dignity of having employment where they want to live and in the industry they want to work in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator